Hello everyone, and welcome to your Masters in Governance and Management. My name is Sandy, and I'll be your host for the online learning component. Now, as you know, your program is mixed between face-to-face lectures as well as online learning. And in addition to the online learning videos you have uploaded on your online platform, you will also have articles, and we will be having a series of interviews with the different lecturers of the course. Today we'll be discussing Module 1. Module 1 is about principles and applications of governance, where we're going to be speaking to Dr. Silvio De Bono, who will be one of your lecturers in the course. He will be sharing his expertise with us today.
Thank you.
Dr. De Bono, thank you for being with us here today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Cheers. So we'll get right to it with a just introductory question.
Yes, sure.
What is governance?
Yes, this is a very interesting question. A lot of people actually ask this question, what is governance? Just like what is management? Governance means different things for different people. For the manager, it means one thing. For the CEO of a company, it means another. For someone in government and public institutions, it means something else. For people who are workers, down the line in the organization hierarchy, it means something else. But in actual fact, governance is a term which is widely used, I would say, and abused. Governance, I would describe governance, and here I'm using my 25 years experience working in the private, public sector, consulting, and education. Governance could easily be described as a fair relationship between the different stakeholders in a particular unit. Now, the unit can have different degrees. In a family structure, there needs to be good governance. There needs to be good understanding between the members of the family. Trust builds good governance. Good communication builds good governance. Understanding the roles and responsibilities of each and every member builds good governance. Understanding what we should do and what we shouldn't do builds good governance in each and every unit. So if you had to ask me what governance is, without being too theoretical, I would say it is an act. It is an act of bringing different parties, different stakeholders, which could be not only internal but also external, which could not only be known but also unknown to that particular organization, which brings them together. So rather than having governance as a noun, it is not something which you can get hold of, but it is something which stakeholders in different institutions, we can understand through different acts. And we tend to say that there's good governance or not good governance depending on whether we agree or disagree with what is happening. Sometimes, I was reading in one of the latest articles, publications about the subject, some people were talking about governance on the road, trying to interpret good behavior and good understanding of how to respect one another, for example, while driving or while parking. Taking parking bays which are not meant to be yours, but they're meant to be for the disabled, for example. The act of doing it is wrong, but building a process where there is a set of rules, regulations, which are known to others, gives a set of governance, gives a sense of tranquility, of identity, of openness, of transparency in a society. Now, you can well understand, Sandy, that different societies are bound by different rules, which sometimes they're implied. And when I say rules, I'm not only referring to the laws and regulations which are enacted in Parliament. That's the legal framework. It's very easy for us to refer to the legal framework because the legal framework can be read even at law. Lawyers disagree on an act of interpretation, for example, let alone if there's no law. So in any society, good governance is not managed by the legal framework, but good governance is managed by the way that society accepts good practice of ensuring that the stakeholders within that particular unit are well informed, are well educated, know exactly what to expect. For example, going to a different country, traveling to a different country. This was what happened to me, and this is on a very personal note. I'm traveling to a completely different country the first time, for example, traveling to Africa. And the lines of queue and the notion of who follows a queue and how a queue is formed was completely obnoxious to me, was completely different to me.
How so?
How so? Because the question of governance there, on a very simple matter of the stakeholder relationship in that particular environment varied. So I was the first one and ended up being the last one. Now, it doesn't mean that I was wrong and they were right, but I was not able to understand how things are governed, are done. So governance is an act of relationship between the stakeholders with getting the job done, with getting the goal reached. In an environment, the goal is to save the environment. In a family, the goal is to have a peaceful family. In an organization, the goal is to have the profit, the output, whatever there is. In a macro environment, the state, society has its own goals. So, in a nutshell, because you can understand it's a rather abstract, but at the same time, I'm trying to simplify it as much as I can. In an abstract word, governance is the act of relationship between the different stakeholders, and through that act of relationship, a goal is attained. So you, me, and everybody else within a particular unit, we need to know what we are bound to do. Very often we speak about duties, but there's also the responsibilities involved in that. So governance is not a one-time thing. Governance is not something, it's not an item that you get off a shelf, but it is this act of relationship. We can interpret it. And different stakeholders in any unit interpret it differently. People who are all in favor of governance and therefore they exercise a very good, excellent level of management and administrative framework in an organization, that means good governance. A very simple thing. Employees taking on the break. That is a relationship. Employer-employee relationship of ensuring that each and every month the national insurance is actually paid. That is an act of governance. Why? Because there is something which governs the relationship between the different stakeholders, and ultimately the end result, the goal, is reached without having the stakeholders having to think and to worry about it. The minute you start thinking and worrying about it, then there's no good governance taking place. Okay. I hope I've tried to simplify the abstract word of governance.
Okay. If we can make it a bit more specific, moving on to my next question, is what about corporate governance specifically?
This has become an issue, particularly over the last 3 decades. And why it has become an issue? It has become an issue because we started with a management system where it was completely top-down. The first principles of scientific management, as you well know, were very much top-down principles of scientific management. Then we moved on to the administrative system of management. Then we moved to the bureaucratic system of management. Then we've moved to giving employees a more role, understanding, particularly after the Hawthorne studies. So organization, corporations, corporate, have been through a cycle. As part of this cycle, now we're talking about good governance in a corporate structure. Good governance in a corporate structure now, it's not only about the way management exercises its duties and responsibilities upon subordinates, or it's not only the way how subordinates are meant to follow the rules and regulations that managers set up, but good corporate governance is all the rules, regulations, all the ethical behavior, all the social and psychosocial systems that are employed in any organization to make the organization flower better and more accountable to the internal players themselves as well to the external players, who could be the shareholders and all the other stakeholders. For example, as a consumer, you need to ensure that there's good corporate governance in any particular organization. And some internationally, for example, even at United Nations levels, some organizations have been highly criticized because they do not have good governance. For example, they may employ employees underage, or they may take advantage of certain group of other employees. Good corporate governance, I would say, from not only from my experience, not only from theory, my experience, but in our consulting work on day-to-day basis, I would explain it in very simple terms, is a very critical but known relationship of the organization activities. And this is very often demonstrated by a number of different attitudes, activities, and relationships. For example, there needs to be active transparency in any organization in order to ensure that the goals are reached. In public organizations, transparency becomes even more important, becomes even more witty, becomes even more critical. And there's an added reason to that. Why? Because that particular organization or the members who are managing that organization are not using their own pocket money, but they're using someone else's money. So at that particular point in time, the act of spending in that particular organization needs to be clear, needs to be well defined, so that at the end of the day, the audit would actually result that the governance of that spending has been in line with the rules and regulations. So I'm constantly drawing parallelisms, not only between the public and the private, because technically they're both corporations in terms of corporate. So technically they're both under the business environment, the business corporate environment, but we both know that they are different. Public officers have to realize even more that their level of transparency, accountability, realization, management, and decision making, amongst others, are all governed not only by rules, which have been implied and employed or taken over in the course of time, but are governed by good practices. At times, good governance, good corporate governance also employs that if there is not such a good practice in an organization, even if it has been regulated by law, it is also important to actually challenge that. Good governance in an organization also implies something which very often people do not pay attention to, which is fairness, equity. And equity and fairness is not only employed on a personal level, but equity and fairness are even more employed in groups, in departments, in units as a whole. When everything is going fine, when there are no problems and when there are no issues, probably nobody talks about governance. But when people start having problems, when there starts doubting, when people start realizing that things could have been done better, when there is the realization that the goal has not been reached, that is what sparks. We were planned to achieve a goal, but for some reason or another, the goal has not been reached. That usually puts on a spark. Mm-hmm. And then we need to go back, we need to trace it back. And why wasn't reached? Because A, B, C, and D. And very often we realize that it also boils down that each and every organization needs to have good governance. Now, so far, I only spoke about internal governance. But what about external governance? Corporations are also directly responsible and accountable to ensure that there is good governance with external stakeholders. And external stakeholders are clients and different degrees of clients. Could be the direct client or the indirect client. So if you're selling a product and the product is then being reused by another supplier and third, fourth party source clients are making use of it, you need to ensure that that is good, safe product which is governed not only by rules but is governed by good practice. For example, some of the latest literature in good governance with external stakeholders has widely been discussed in the fisheries and agricultural sector. Not only the amount of tuna, for example, and other type of fish that can be caught, that can be exported, but how? How to ensure sustainability. The same in agriculture, the type of insecticides and pesticides which are being used to reach a goal, but ultimately that good governance practice has a bearing on society too. And that's why certain international organizations actually try to then impose international legislation. Now, literature suggests that there seems to be a dichotomy. Sometimes these seems to be at two opposing ends. The international regulations, the international framework, the legal framework, and governance. Some people could say, if we have good governance, self-imposed discipline, self-imposed governance at a personal level, at a family level, at a corporate level, at a national level, then we probably don't need the international sanctions at times. So is it the case where sanctions are imposed because governance is not being employed, or is it that because we need to ensure that there's good governance? One thing which I've said earlier on is that we are here talking about an act which is also highly affected by different cultural, societal perspectives. And what is termed to be good, ethically correct, in a particular societal framework can definitely be misinterpreted in a different societal framework. So when we speak, for example, like the rule of law, lately we've heard this term several times, the rule of law. The rule of law can actually mean different things in different societal framework. I'm not saying it is right or wrong, but the governance of that particular society, of what is accepted as a norm, could vary. So we need to understand that here we're not talking about something which is simple in terms that it has one unique definition, but we are referring to something which is constantly evolving, which is constantly changing. Not only changing because, we need to do it to feel safer, but it is constantly being challenged. For example, internationally, and I need to also speak internationally, so we started with the corporate, the national, and then we're going internationally. We need to speak internationally because no country is isolated from others. We could be an island, we are an island, but being an island does not mean that it is isolating us from other countries, and it doesn't mean that we are also being isolated from what the international community is actually doing. And from what organizations, therefore, are doing. A case in point was emissions. A case in point is emissions, for example, first at international level, then at a national level. Now, the concept of good governance and emissions is going to affect us as an individual in 10, 15, 20 years' time, when we can only drive electric cars and we cannot drive any other type of cars. So as you can see, it is not something which can only be defined at a particular unit, and you cannot enlarge it, take it in other areas.
Okay, thank you. Now I'd like to move on to the main principles of governance. and any cross-cutting issues you could identify.
Cross-cutting issues very often are like having good practices.
Mm-hmm.
Each and every structure, each and every organization cannot be isolated. For example, if we are in a particular chain, in a supply chain, where one company is producing one item and the other company is producing any other item, a cross-cutting issue would be that in my areas of production, I have to ensure that I'm getting the right thing from my supplier and I'm giving the right thing to from my contributor to my supplier. So the line there needs to be clear. Cross-cutting issues as well are not only therefore based on the line of production, but there's also based on the integrity of the organization, of how well at an individual level people understand, relate, communicate, define, accept the responsibility, and share. This is very much a governance at a personal level. Then another cross-cutting issue is not only how we do it on the personal level, but how we communicate and define our responsibility and job at a group level, where what I do as a person, what we do as a person, the rules that govern us in a particular department is going to have an effect on the rules that is going to be governed on another department. And this is also a case where individual needs to abide within themselves a sense of critical identity of that particular organization. You've mentioned earlier on corporate governance, and I said that corporate governance cannot be isolated from organizational theory and cannot be isolated from organizational development. You well know, because you come from the same field, that individuals within organizations needs to feel committed.
Mm-hmm.
If you feel committed in an organization, you don't need any rules, laws, and regulations that actually tells you what to do and what not to do. So your sense of commitment brings with it sense of governance, which is not imposed, but it's implied. So when we're actually talking about the cross-cultural references and anecdotes in any organization, I am one of those who maybe adopts more of a liberal approach. Okay. And the liberal approach teaches me that the first thing that we need to do is give employees the right to behave themselves. You can work in an organization where it is an open organization, where drawers are not locked, where any employee can go in any office, but employees themselves know where to go and where not to go. Now, this is not easy. And it's not easy because there a sense of responsibility, which is then reflected to good governance, because then governance there is reflected in behavior, is a known relationship between two or more parties. Some people could say the fact that the room is left open and the drawer is unlocked, that is probing people to actually open the drawer even if they don't have to. A liberal frame of mind, adopting good governance in organizations, would say differently, would tell the respective people that you don't need that room, or you don't need a drawer and what's in it. But you can always do it. Mm-hmm. A liberal frame of governance would actually set fewer rules, fewer regulations, but would become more goal-oriented in that particular governance structure. The issue is that not each and every organization can do this. The reality is, and here I'm putting on my consulting hat, 25 years consulting hat, you do realize that smaller organizations, which are more knowledge-based structures, which are more client-centric structures, the probability is that they can adopt and adapt a more liberal governance structures than bigger organizations where ownership is not clear or ownership is varied, where the competition and the responsibility between different employees is more vulgar, because if there is particularly, competition is induced, is increased in that particular organization structure, then employees themselves would try to see how they're going to be better than their colleagues. So that in itself, if there are not enough rules and regulations that would govern that relationship, would require higher act of governance in order to ensure transparency and tranquility. For example, if you take a case of promotions and interviews and what's not in a public environment is different to a private environment, or big organizations in relation to small organizations, where the criteria has to be clear, where when the point system has to be well known, where the unions are very often involved there being watchdog, where you would have even third parties watching the process and how you're doing it. Why are we doing this? Because it is bigger, because the sense of trust, governance requires that there would be an imposition of a method to ensure that governance there is ensured. Going back to what is governance, to the act of relationship. So you can either have a liberal, some people would even call it a libertarian approach, which is too liberal at times, where you can actually have a self-imposition of good governance. Or else you can have people where they see that there's not enough trust and transparency and commitment, and therefore that governance has to be brought in by imposing further rules, regulations, and what's not. The most important thing is that at the end of the day, things are done, goals are reached, and what's promised as part of the organizational commitment is achieved. Because if organizations at the end of the day do not reach their output, do not reach their commitment, first with the shareholder, then with their employees and with their customers, the probability is that the organizations would even cease to exist.
Cool. All right. And my last question for you today, Dr. De Bono, is quite a vast one. But in your view, what are the essential recommendations for an effective corporate governance?
Well, the list could be endless. And I would say that different organizations, according to the level of governance, may have a different set of priorities. I would start by first qualifying this by promoting a good personal ethical behavior. In my experience, I can say that good governance starts when primarily there is good personal ethical behavior. And I am one of those, as you probably know, that I hate rules. And I find it very difficult to impose a rule because, as a liberal person myself, I think that each and every person needs to be ethical enough to have his or her rules and regulations without having anybody else telling him or her what to do. And at the place of work, this is reflected by so many different things. For example, the time you walk in and out. For example, the breaks you take if there is no system where breaks are recorded. The responsibility of your work and how diligent you become in your work. That is an ethical issue. Now, we can open another Pandora's box here and spend another hour or so discussing ethics and the difference between ethical and the legal issue. So, in my opinion, I start with the personal ethical behavior. Then, on a personal level, I think that there needs to be good. Now, good is very subjective, but in every organization there needs to be a drive towards ensuring that a team would be there. Because the higher levels of team, the lower levels of conflict. Now, are we saying that conflicts are going to be eliminated? the big answer to this question is definitely no. So in addition to that, I would say that good governance needs to create a good framework where conflicts are tackled at source. What do we mean when we say conflicts are tackled at source? We mean that at any point in time, a good person managing the organization, governing the relationship, needs to understand that conflict is bound to happen from time to time and for different reasons. Good governance means that that conflict needs to be looked into. It is in the interest of the organization that the conflict is looked into, and not only the interest of the individuals, because individuals can cope to work in conflict, but the organization cannot cope to have individuals working in conflict, because ultimately the goal is not reached, and this is where people actually make this constant difference. You ask people, you're in consulting, so you know this. You ask people, but how are you dealing with conflict? Well, we just talk on work-related issues and that's it. It simply cannot be. You cannot ensure good governance if you are in conflict with your colleague. Why? Because on a personal level as well, good governance induces caring. Very few people actually have written about this. There's new literature in the field which is suggesting that on a personal level, good governance also means caring. Caring for one another means that if something is wrong, which is not going to directly affect you, but it is going to affect your colleague, good governance implies that you would look after your colleague even when your colleague is not there. Mm-hmm. Because that would create better teamwork and better understanding between trust, and therefore the small nucleus starts building. The problem which we make when we're talking about good corporate governance is that we start from the onion model, from the outer shell. Mm-hmm. I would prefer, and here I'm using more experience than knowledge, I would prefer starting with the inner core. Once the inner core is strong, once the team, the individual, and the respective small team is strong, then you can build on the next level. And the next level are the work processes. Are they fair? Are they just? Is work well distributed? Is it equitable? You know just as much as I do that we all try to ensure equitable, justified work, and work is distributed, and each and every person within the team has equal level of responsibility. But sometimes we live in a utopian dream. Or sometimes I could say that to have a complete equitable structure is a utopian dream. In fact, then this should be well rewarded, because those who are higher and they're assuming more, because even by nature they can assume more. And I'm not talking about their competences here, I'm talking about their attitude. Then they have to be rewarded that their progression is higher. So that needs to be adequately rewarded, because if you're not going to reward that person who is actually more committed, even from an attitudinal perspective, then you're not governing well. Then the level of governance at the second level of this onion, I'm talking about from the core going there, it's not working well. If that works well, then you start building the corporate, the systems, the procedures, the auditable audit trails, the internal processes which make up the organization even safer. For example, if we can use fewer paper, why should we use more paper? If we can use less printouts, why should we use more printouts in order to actually do a job? Because this is not only having an impact on the organization, but it is also a relationship with our external world. And the external world is not only the other clients, other suppliers, but the external world with the environment around us. Mm-hmm. So governance, I would say, is a way of thinking, a way of building up a relationship with yourself, with those around you, and with the environment. And this is why I personally think that it is a subject which should be taught to children from a very early age. Because governance, and I close by just saying one thing, good governance, it's all about good respect. And if you respect someone, then you go out of your way and you ensure that the rules, which sometimes are not there, are followed to ensure that that respect is completely achieved.
All right. Well, thank you. That pretty much sums up the questions I have for you today, Dr. De Bono. I'd like to thank you for sharing your experience as well as the academic theory behind all of the topics of governance.
Thank you.
All right. So there you have it. Today we spoke about principles and applications of governance. We defined what is governance, and we also looked into the corporate, specifically corporate governance. And then we went on to identifying the main principles and the issues, cross-cutting issues related to governance. And then we ended with best practices using experience from Dr. De Bono. That's it for Module 1. I'll see you next time.